Before I read the text here, I love this chapter. I'm just going to tell you. I'm so excited to get to be here in this part. Except for that page that I want. It's in one of these packets. Let me grab one. Hang on just a second. All right. Before I read that, I want to do a little theme, a little review of our theme, because it's going to help us with chapter 11. This started out as just my class notes, my teaching notes that I make myself. And then I thought, you know what, this might be good to just keep so that you can go back and look at. So under Romans chapters 9 through 11 theme, God will keep his promise in your notebook. Pull that out, and we're going to go over that real quickly. All right. So the theme, God will keep his promises, is do you have that? Should be. Susie's looking confused. All right. Right at the very beginning. All right. So he's going to keep his promises to Israel. He's going to keep his promises to the church, to individuals. He's going to keep his promises to believers. And sadly, he's going to keep his promises to unbelievers. Divine judgment is a promise. And that is something that is promised to unbelievers. Now, Romans 8, remember, nothing can separate us from the love of God. Neither tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword. If you remember, that's one of the most beautiful poetic parts of the book of Romans. And we talked about nothing can separate us from the love of God. Chapters 1 through 8, we discussed the righteousness of God. And righteousness of God is the theme of the overall theme of Romans anyway. In chapters 1 through 3, we discussed the fact that every person who has ever been born is born in sin and has come short of the righteousness of God. That's everyone. And he goes through in those chapters, and he first talks about the Jew. You've sinned and you've come short of the righteousness of God. The Gentile, you've sinned, you've come short of the righteousness of God. The cultured Greek, the elite ones, you've sinned and come short of the righteousness of God. The uncultured, you've sinned and you've come short of the righteousness of God. He made sure that everyone knew that they were in need of something. In chapters 4 through 8, he described, how do you fix that sin problem? Well, we learned God will provide his son, and the righteousness that we are unable to attain on our own will come through his son. Salvation has the three parts: the past, present, and future, what we just discussed. Justification, sanctification, glorification. Because we're assured that we have been justified, that we are being sanctified, we know and we can rest in the fact that we, at a future date, will be glorified. So after chapter 8 was over with, you might think that Paul was going to tell us how to have this righteousness that he describes in our everyday life. That's what he does in the book of Ephesians, which was written before this. And so you think, okay, well, that's kind of how it goes. Well, next week, the week would get to chapter 12, that's exactly what he's going to do. He's going to get to, okay, now this is how you use righteousness in your life, daily life. And then in 13, he's going to say, and this is how it works in the government. Oh yeah, don't miss that one. You want to come for that one. And so he's going to tell us then how to be more practical with that righteousness that we have. But in between there, we have this idea of 9 through 11. Remember, I told you a lot of teachers will teach, oh, that's just like a parenthetical teaching. Paul just kind of randomly had one of those little, blurbs in his head where he went, oh, and then also I want to talk about the Jews. And so they think of it as a set apart, like you could scoop it out of the Bible and set it apart and go straight from 8 to 12 and be just perfectly fine. But instead, Paul goes on to teach us about the righteousness of God, which has been the theme that he's been using the whole time. But now it's the righteousness of God in dealing with Israel. Why is that even important? Well, at the end of chapter 8, Paul says nothing can separate us from the love of God. All right, we have that. But the argument was, well, God has made promises to Israel throughout the Old Testament. All right, so we know prophetically there was the promises, the covenants he made with Abraham, land, descendants, a kingdom, all of the things that were going to become a time of peace, where there would be, where there would be perfect peace, where Israel would be the light upon the hill. All of these promises that were made, promises for national salvation and restoration, and then, of course, all of those earthly, physical promises. But for the last 2,000 years, Israel has been in unbelief. And so if nothing can separate us from the love of God, how do you explain Israel? That's the argument that Paul is going to talk about here. So if you're talking about the righteousness of God, and if you're talking about the promises of God, and if you want to trust that all of those promises are going to be yours someday, how do you explain Israel? Because there are lots of promises for Israel, lots of promises. And if those haven't been fulfilled, how do you explain that? And so Paul is going to take 9 through 11, and he is going to continue his teaching on righteousness by using these points. And when I'm reading today, I want you to think about these points that we're going to talk about. First of all, the rejection of the Messiah by Israel did not take God by surprise. All right, he didn't go, okay, I'm going to try really, really hard. And then when the nation of Israel did not accept Jesus and crucified him instead, then he had to go back to the drawing board and come up with a whole new plan. That's not how it worked. This did not take God by surprise that there would be a rejection. In fact, there is plenty of scripture in the Old Testament that talks about Israel turning its back on God, and then when God would restore them and how he would restore them. There are examples in the Old Testament of Israel turning its back on God and then how he would restore them. Golly, you can go all the way back early as in the Exodus, when they were out in the wilderness and they built the golden calf. You know, they took off their earrings, they threw them in the fire. Aaron said a golden calf just popped out, and they worshiped it. And God was very angry. So was Moses. He threw the tablets of stone down. And so there had to be a restoration even at that time. And so all throughout the history, we see that that is something that God talks about. The second one is this plan of God made it possible to call out Gentiles as well as Jews, apart from the national promises and instructions given to Israel. This plan calls out individuals who by faith alone will come into a relationship with God. So in that, we're going to learn that in the Old Testament, Israel had a plan. Gentiles, there weren't very many, but there's examples of Gentiles who came to know the God of Israel, but how they came to know him was that they came under Judaism. So they came through Israel. They converted. They came to know the God of Israel in that way. And so that was really the only avenue that was open to the Gentiles at that time. God was not working in a separate way at that time. That was not the dispensation for that. So now we're going to see that there's Paul's going to describe in chapter 11 a separate plan, a different plan that is going to be a way that Jew and Gentile comes into relationship with him, comes in to seek his righteousness, and the Gentile does not need to go through Israel. Ooh, that's going to cause a problem. It's going to cause a problem for Israel, who thinks we're the only way. So that's not going to work. And it's going to cause a problem for the Gentiles because the Gentiles have never seen this before, and it's a brand new thing. And so everybody's coming to grips with a whole new plan of God. In chapter 11, we learn that the rejection of national Israel as a nation, is not total and it's not final. At the appropriate appointed time, Paul's going to call that the fullness of the Gentiles, and we'll get to that in a little bit. God will once again deal with the nation of Israel and his chosen people separately. separately. He's going to deal with the nation of Israel. That plan that he has for them, those promises that he's made for them, are going to be picked up once again. They're not going to be left hanging. Who does that? Oh, kids, we're going to go to Disneyland tomorrow. And then, you never fulfill that. You never do that. Your kids wake up the next morning, put on your clothes, and you're like, oh, we're just not doing it. What kind of parent does that? That's not what we're going to see here. So throughout all of the Old Testament, God had a plan for Jew and Gentile. Israel would be his covenant nation, the only one in history. There is no other nation that God has ever made a covenant with. Please do not be misconstrued by that. It doesn't matter what nation you name. There is no nation that God has a covenant with, except for the nation of Israel. And through their obedience to him, they would be a light to the Gentiles. But in that plan, for the Gentiles to have an opportunity to be blessed by God, Israel had to be in obedience. So when Israel was out of obedience with God, how could the Gentiles get in? There was really no way. Look at the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes up in the northern kingdom. And they were out of obedience with God. They had wicked rulers. They were into idolatry. They had golden calves up there. It was a wicked, wicked place. How in the world is a Gentile going to come to know God through them? So see, Israel had to be in obedience in order to be a conduit for the Gentiles. Second page. But there was always another plan in the mind of God. Paul is going to call it in chapter 11 the mystery, which means that it was not revealed to mankind until a specific time. It doesn't mean that it's some shocking thing. That it just means that it's the plan of God that has not been revealed. There was a time when it would be revealed. It's kind of like, think about when the Mosaic Law was revealed. Noah didn't have that. It wasn't time. There was an appointed time when that would be revealed to mankind. So this mystery plan of God was that the national Israel, the nation of Israel as a whole, is going to be out of relationship with God for a period of time. And the Gentiles are not going to be dependent on that in order to come to God. When Israel rejected the Messiah and the kingdom, remember that's what Jesus did in the 3 years he was here. He went to the nation of Israel. He told his disciples, I'm going only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And he went to the house of Israel and he offered them his to submit themselves to him as the Messiah, and he offered them the kingdom. That kingdom that was promised in the Old Testament. That kingdom was promised. And it was rejected at that time. He came to offer, when Israel rejected all that he came to offer, God had every right to pour out his wrath upon the people. Remember when we studied Revelation, we see what that looks like. We see what that wrath looks like. And he could have done that right then. Right at the time that Israel crucified Jesus, rejected him, God could have poured out his wrath. Remember when Jesus stands up and he reads from the scroll of Isaiah, and he reads that passage. He leaves out the very ending of that passage, which talks about the wrath of God to come, because Jesus did not come to do that in his first coming. That wrath was not the appointed time for that yet. He reads up until that point of what he's going to do, and then he stops there, because that's not what he came to accomplish at that time. And so instead of pouring out his wrath on mankind, he pours out his mercy with this new dispensation that we're going to be talking about in chapter 11. The gospel of Jesus Christ, belief in his death, burial, and resurrection. Remember, we've talked about this before. Sometimes people forget that in the early part of the Gospels, that was not the gospel. The death, burial of Jesus Christ and resurrection of Jesus Christ was not the gospel in the Gospels, because he was not dead, he had not been buried, and he had not been resurrected. You could not believe in that. What you were to believe in was that the king is coming, the kingdom is at hand, the Messiah is here. It was a dispensation of that. Now the gospel is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's what we are to believe. And this is a gospel of grace, and it is dependent solely on faith. different. It looks different. While the Jews also were dependent solely on faith, it looks different in how it's being done because they don't have to come in. Gentiles don't have to come in through the Jews. They can participate equally, and there isn't any other prerequisite. If you remember in Acts chapter 15, there was the big argument about, okay, well, we'll let the Gentiles come in. But if they come in, they got to be circumcised. And, they need to follow the law. And this was believers in Jesus who were Jews said, this can't work. This is not how it works. And so there was that big discussion in Acts chapter 15 where they finally come up, James, the brother of Jesus, the half brother of Jesus, he says, okay, so we now see that Paul is going to the Gentiles and we're not going to put a burden on them other than what it already is, just the believing part. So this is what Paul is going to be explaining in chapters 9 through 11. It's not a parenthesis teaching that is separate from the rest of Romans, even though oftentimes you will hear it taught that way. Instead, it's going to detail even further the God that we all serve, Jew and Gentile, male and female, slave and master, rich and poor. It was an invitation from God to humanity, an invitation to come to him for rest when we are weak and heavy laden, an invitation to lean into him for strength and sustenance when we have no hope. It was an invitation to lay down our filthy rags of sin and be covered in a white linen robe of righteousness that is provided solely by Jesus Christ. And so, like Paul, we cry out to the master potter of mankind, the depth and the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God. Okay, so hopefully that brings us all kind of up to date on what we've been studying up to this point. Woo, we're going to have 10 minutes. I can probably read this, and then we'll do a little talking after we go outside. All right, I'm going to read chapter 11 before we go. Israel's rejection is not total. I say then, has God cast away his people? Certainly not. For I also am an Israelite, of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not cast away his people whom he foreknew. Or do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah, how he pleads with God against Israel, saying, Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what does the divine response say to him? I have reserved for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Even so then, at this present time, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. And if by grace, then it is no longer of works. Otherwise, grace is no longer grace. But if it is of works, it's no longer grace. Otherwise, work is no longer work. What then? Israel has not obtained what it seeks, but the elect have obtained it, and the rest were blinded. Just as it is written, God has given them a spirit of stupor, eyes that they could not see, and ears that they could not hear to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a recompense to them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they do not see, and bow down their back always. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Certainly not. But through their fall, to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Now, if their fall is riches for the world, and their failure riches for the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? For I speak to you, Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry, if by any means I may provoke to jealousy those who are my flesh and save some of them. For if their being cast away is the reconciling of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? For if the first fruit is holy, then the lump is also holy. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. And if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them became partakers of the root and the fatness of the olive tree, do not boast against the branches. But if you do boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, well, branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well said. Because of unbelief, they were broken off, and you stand by faith. Do not be haughty, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he may not spare you either. Therefore, consider the goodness and severity of God. On those who fell, severity, but towards you, goodness, if you continue in his goodness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will those who are the natural branches be grafted back into their own olive tree? For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come out of Zion, and he will turn away ungodliness from Jacob. For this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, but concerning the election, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. For as you were once disobedient to God, yet you have now obtained mercy through their disobedience, even so these also have now been disobedient, that through the mercy shown you, they also may obtain mercy. For God has committed them to disobedience, that he might have mercy on all. Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, and his ways past finding out. For who has known the mind of God? Or who has become his counselor? Or who has first given to him, and it shall be repaid to him? For of him, and through him, and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever. Amen. All right. We're going to be, as you can see by these 3 pages that I have left in here, talking a lot about cultivation, what it's like to be grafted in, what that may look like, and talk about what Paul is discussing here in chapter 11 as far as the grafting in. I don't know that we'll get through the whole thing today, since we're going to take this little break and go look at the solar eclipse here in a minute. And then we'll come back in and finish a little bit more teaching, and then I'll send you on your way. But I also am going to attach to this teaching a little bit on replacement theology at the end of it, because that's where this comes from. That's both the reason that they teach it, but it's also the reason why we stand against it. And it's very clear that we need to properly understand this, because improperly understanding it changes your entire theology. And if it changes your entire theology, that means your eschatology. Remember, that's the study of things that are going to come, prophetic things down the road that are going to happen in the future. If it's your theology, that means the way that you think today about the nation of Israel. If it changes your theology, that means, why do we pray for Israel now? Why do we stand with Israel? Boy, is that a hard thing to do right now? Is that a difficult thing in what's going on right now? Why do Christians stand with Israel regardless of what's going on? Is there a mandate for that? Are we in error of doing that? Why, there's all these questions that are really pertinent right now, especially considering what's going on in our world. Of course, this has been going on in the life of Israel for the last 75 years, not to mention all those thousands of years previous to that. So that's going to be, but I am going to attach that teaching at the back end of our chapter 11 teaching, so that we have a really clear understanding of that. Then we'll pop back into, okay, now it's all about me. How does righteousness affect me? So we'll get to that. All right. So I am going to give you a little break here.